Hello and welcome to the official closure of the Open Session 2020 Special Edition of the European Commission for the Control of Foot and Mouth Disease, or EuFMD. I'm Carissa Miller, a veterinarian who's working with EuFMD, and I'll be moderating this final session. To kickstart the session, I'd like to pass you over to Fabrizio Rosso, the Deputy Executive Secretary of EuFMD. Over to you, Fabrizio.
Good morning, good afternoon, Carissa, and welcome to all participants to the final session of the Open Session 2020 Special Edition with the title Livelihood at Risk in a Faster World. And in recent years, FMD and similar transboundary animal diseases, what we call fast diseases, have made indeed frequent intercontinental and interregional incursions that were not always contained. And recently, we saw the occurrence of diseases like lumpy skin disease, Rift Valley fever, also African swine fever in countries and regions previously not affected, while FMD remains widespread in many parts of the world and significant jumps of viruses are frequently observed between different pools. So what is being done to better forecast fast disease spread, to target surveillance and control measures, and to communicate risks? How can livestock business and livelihood be better protected in regions coping with the persistence of fast diseases or frequent reintroductions? And what are the lessons learned from the COVID for fast disease management? How we can work efficiently without travel, and how to enhance biosecurity and behavior change to mitigate risks? So these were some of the questions we proposed and tried to answer during the conference that was organized totally in virtual modality. The innovative solution adopted to hold the conference, creating a virtual environment, was also a chance for us to reflect on how challenges, such as the current impossibility to travel and meet in person, can be taken as opportunities. In 2020, we all observed an increased demand of training, conferences, events delivered in virtual settings. And the use of the virtual reality can mitigate the difficulties in the delivery of such events, trainings, meetings, and different capacity building initiatives in distant settings. Even though, I should say, not replacing the beauty of meeting in person that I believe we still all miss. And I hope you had the chance to visit with the virtual tour of the Open Session 2020 available online, the EuFMD Lighthouse with different live sessions and events, posters, games, highlights, and rooms where partners presented their activity and contributions to FMD control. During this conference, we went through 4 live sessions attended by more than 3,000 participants, with a total of 46 papers presented and more than 75 posters virtually displayed. Workshops were also organized during the open session, with more than 100 experts in different public and private sectors involved to discuss more in detail specific issues related to risk mapping and forecasting, performance of risk-based surveillance, laboratory emergency preparedness, modeling, cost-benefit of control options, and forecasting of vaccine demand. All of this was possible thanks to a very committed and efficient EuFMD team that provided all the support required from the technical, operational, and communication point of view, and which I want here to thank very much, without mentioning any name, as a lot of staff assisted the organization of the open session. And thank also to the Standing Technical Committee, chaired by Stefan Zientara, and represented today by 2 of its members, Professor James Wood and Dr. Giancarlo Ferrari, for having scientifically led the conference. So the title of the open session is Livestock at Risk in a Faster World. And for this final session, the closure session, we have invited speakers that can provide relevant contributions to estimate the impact of fast diseases on business and livelihood, but also to identification of priorities strategies and policies to mitigate risks of fast occurrence or reoccurrence. And considering that the public and private sectors have both a duty in improving resilience of livestock sector to fast diseases, in this session we will hear also challenges, but also opportunities to create business environment for fast control. With these few introductory words, I leave you to the final session of the Open Session Special Edition. I hope you can enjoy the session. I would like to thank in advance the speakers and the panelists who have accepted to participate. And of course, thanks to you for attending, and see you soon in another virtual event, or better to say, hope very soon in person. Thank you, Carissa, also for your support in moderating the session, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for recapping the open session as it's been and for setting the scene so well for this final session today. I now would like to hand us over to James Wood, who we are fortunate enough to have today to provide a recap on the conclusions and recommendations from the 4 live sessions that we had during December 2020 for the open session. So James Wood is a veterinary epidemiologist who leads the Disease Dynamics Unit in Cambridge University and conducts multidisciplinary research on infectious diseases. His research interests are focused on infectious disease emergence and its control, and ensuring that research impacts on policy is a particular interest. Diseases studied at the Disease Dynamics Unit include collaborative studies on zoonotic transfer and emergence of RNA viruses from bats in Africa, control of bovine tuberculosis and blue tongue, and pandemic influenza H1N1 impact in pigs. And of course, James is also on our standing technical committee of the EuFMD. So James, I hand over to you now in your capable hands for a summary of the live sessions so far. Thanks, James.
Carissa and Fabrizio, thank you very much indeed for that. I've prepared a few slides which I hope can be put on the screen now. Fabrizio's covered a lot of these, the content of these. So if I can move very quickly through the first few slides. What I'm going to do is very briefly try and summarize some of the key recommendations coming from this amazing conference. Next slide, please. Where, as Fabrizio says, there were 4 virtual sessions, which I'll cover in a little bit more depth. And very importantly, the emphasis of this biannual open session of EuFMD, foot and mouth disease remains a focus, with an important and growing significance attached to other transboundary diseases, which are obviously other important fast diseases. And a theme throughout all of this is, what can we learn from COVID working, both in terms of how we work, but also what are the lessons in terms of epidemic control? Next slide, please. And I think that you've all experienced the remarkable online platform that EuFMD has used. And I think this looks very good to me. I think there's a huge amount of work behind the scenes carried out to make all of these different activities so successful as they were for the between 3,000 and 4,000 people who attended EuFMD's Open Session 2020 from around the world. Next slide, please. So after I'm going to say a standard type of opening session with some really high-level dignitaries from the sector speaking at this, which is very important reflection of the significance attached to the work of EuFMD and the threat that is posed to livelihoods from FMD and from other fast diseases. Move on, next slide, please. It started off with a keynote session, which focused on the 3 of the most important transboundary diseases: foot and mouth disease, peste des petits ruminants, and lumpy skin disease. All of these invaluable reviews provided conference attendees with significant and updated background information, with a focus coming from conclusions on the need for sample sharing, surveillance and control for best international tackling of these diseases. Next slide, please. The first of the four specific scientific sessions, measuring animal movements and drivers for fast disease risk mapping. Some of just the take-home conclusions in this very limited period. Livestock movement data are critical for targeting interventions during fast disease outbreaks. And modelling, particularly including those, can mitigate uncertainty, not least around the environmental and ecological factors that can be very difficult to analyse and make sense of on the ground. We need a greater understanding of the drivers of livestock mobility, including both the environmental and economic and social factors underpinning them, but very importantly, the commercial factors underpinning livestock mobility. And there was a real feeling that risk management and forecasting tools can be improved with the combination of standard epidemiological models with those that include movement, particularly those that take the approach that includes ecological and environmental variables as well. And there was a hope that these could be made more available through open source approaches. Also recognizing the importance of participatory approaches to develop, to collect more qualitative data where routine quantitative data may be unavailable. So there's a great first scientific session. Next slide, please. The second scientific session, from risk to actions, making them happen. So a real focus on impact here. There was a lot of discussion of modelling and a very clear conclusion that models should be used for planning and response, with far too often it's felt that these are used just in response, and actually their use in planning can be equally, if not greater, than their utility in helping to deal with the response. There's greater benefit from collaborations that can be gained. And collaborations should include important stakeholders, not just scientists and decision makers, to make sure you've got full engagement and trust, which is so important when you're trying to control the disease in real time. And again, we came back to the need for holistic approaches that include economics, social studies and epidemiology. And the understanding of the impact on livelihoods and economics was really emphasized throughout this session to improve rational decision making. In order to deliver holistic approaches, we need greater data integration, including all of these things, and then use these tools to help with effective communication of risk. And again, that communication needs to start in peacetime. Next slide, please. Vaccine security and critical responses for emergency management. A lot of discussion around procurement, which is what you'd expect. And this is a very high-level summary of some detailed discussions that all of the attendees engaged with and benefited from. Procurement was felt could benefit from diversification, thinking about newer materials, possibly alternative testing systems, with improved communication and collaboration, and greater collaboration and information sharing. During peacetime, it's really important to think about what scenario planning, so that you can come up with best planning of vaccine banks. And that can be assisted with third-party agencies helping both with the planning but also with the implementation of vaccination policies during crises. Very importantly, modelling can be useful to help plan vaccine dose requirements rather than just being based on empirical measurements. Often, contingency planning in the past has been based almost entirely around foot and mouth disease, but in fact these different transboundary diseases have quite different characteristics. Although they can all spread very rapidly, ideally contingency planning should be disease specific, and those disease specific plans should include engagement with vaccine manufacturers. And again, the planning really must include economic analyses to understand the impact of these diseases on livelihood, as well as on more standard epidemiological measures. Thinking very much about the vaccine banks and how they're used, It was felt the advantages in broadening the reach of vaccine banks to include being sited in endemic countries. Independently of that, also the significance of high potency vaccines was emphasized. Prioritization then of vaccine usage is important and must again include stakeholder engagement to ensure that acceptance and acceptability and optimal usage. Next slide, please. So then the fourth session was focused on resilience to long-term fast disease crises, where the significance of the private sector was an active involvement with the private sector was critically recognized. There was some overlap in the conclusions that came from the other sections and included focuses on ongoing surveillance during peacetime, the use of modeling, planning, obviously relating to geographic compartmentalization. All of these things should be planned prior to outbreaks. And again, very importantly, emphases throughout this session on stakeholder involvement being critical to the success of responses to fast disease crises. All in all, that's a gallop through a remarkable set of four sessions which were delivered in a really powerful way through this online platform. I think that the EuFMD should be congratulated for putting together such an excellent program at such difficult times. I hope that the rest of the session will be great, and I know it will be, and will build on all of the information that was and the knowledge that was gained by those attending the four scientific sessions of OS20 of EuFMD. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, James, for providing that summary. It's no small feat to summarize the vast amount of really valuable learnings that we've gotten from this conference in such a short amount of time, so you did very well. And of course, those recommendations and conclusions will be captured in the formal report that will be available in more detail as well shortly. So thank you very much, James.
Thank you.
Now, before we move on, just a quick note to everybody that the format of this session is going to include some keynote presentations, after which there is a round table, and the presenters will be attending the round table and can respond to your questions. So if you would like to ask a question to any of the presenters that are to follow, please do jump onto the eufmdvirtual.com website, the conference webpage, and post your questions on the forum for the presenters. And now I would like to introduce to you your chair for this session, Giancarlo Ferrari. So Giancarlo is a veterinarian specialized in epidemiology and biostatistics. And in previous work for the Food and Agriculture Organization, Giancarlo has coordinated a regional project across Central Asia and was also based in Afghanistan, leading a project on foot and mouth disease and peste des petits ruminants. In collaboration with EuFMD, he has worked on the formulation of the foot and mouth disease progressive control pathway, and is currently working at the IZSLT, the Istituto Zooprofilattico del Lazio e della Toscana in Rome. And of course, he is a member of the EuFMD Standing Technical Committee. So thank you, and over to you, Giancarlo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carissa, for this, for introducing me. We are, as you already know, this is the very last session of the Open Session 2020. And at this stage, I can only join my colleagues, my colleague James Wood, in congratulating with all the EuFMD team for the excellent work that has been done. It's been very challenging to organize this event, given the COVID situation that you all know. But at the end of the results, I think were excellent. And as Fabrizio has reminded, more than 3,000 participants joined the Open Session 2020. I personally would like to congratulate with all the EuFMD staff, especially those, and there are many, that have worked behind the scene. So a special acknowledgement, it goes to them and to all the EuFMD staff. The first topic of this final session is going to address the socioeconomic aspects of fast diseases. I will not take much time, but it's a rather important and relevant aspect. And a comprehensive approach to fast disease requires that their control cannot ignore the fact that livestock owners are affected by the impact of diseases on their own, but also by the control measures to contain such diseases. And it's important that in any socioeconomic evaluation, we are able to better quantify these aspects to be included in a thorough evaluation, which I think it's rather important because it gives probably, or hopefully, let's say, a strong justification to invest in prevention. I think we all know that prevention is a very difficult product to sell, because when you prevent, you don't see the impact, the consequence of the disease. And this makes a quite difficult product to be sold. Possibly the quantification of this socioeconomic aspect in a broader sense may provide a good framework through which this type of investment can be made. With this, I give the floor back to Carissa to introduce the first speaker for the first presentation of this last session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giancarlo, for opening this session for us and setting the scene. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker for this session. The presentation is a joint presentation. It will be provided by Jonathan Rushton, Professor of Animal Health and Food Systems Economics at the University of Liverpool. Jonathan will be presenting on behalf also of Wudu Jambaru from the International Livestock Research Institute in Ethiopia, and Megan Bruce from Murdoch University in Australia. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Carissa, and thank you for the invitation to give this talk today to the whole EuFMD team. I want to cover the subject area of thinking more carefully about the socioeconomic impact of the fast diseases. I can see I'm getting the problems, but I hope you can still hear me. And what I want to do is outline a little bit first. Therefore, impact on different types of communities. So if you go to the next slide, please, Tiziana. Go to the outline of the presentation. And then I want to come back to a point raised by James a little bit in terms of thinking more carefully about where these diseases actually sit within the whole realm of animal health in general. So when we think about fast diseases, we are thinking about transboundary animal diseases, something that actually spreads quite quickly across different populations. When we're thinking about communities, we are thinking about groups of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common or common ownership. In this case, we're thinking about the common ownership of disease. So next slide, please, Tiziana. Why are we interested in that process? Why do we need to worry about fast diseases? Well, I've tried to break this down into three rough categories of how I think about diseases, these diseases in general. We've got countries that are actually without any kind of fast diseases. They consider them to be exotic. We've got countries with ongoing programs to eliminate these diseases. And then we've got countries that actually have endemic fast diseases. And I want to go through that list in general, but just remind ourselves with the pioneering work done by EuFMD, next slide, please, where we're thinking more carefully about the PCP pathway across this particular series of steps in terms of actually improving how we manage disease. I think this particular model has been very successful in terms of getting people to think about how we move from one stage to the next and do investments across that. So go to the next slide, please, Tiziana. And I want to begin by thinking more carefully about countries that are free of fast diseases. Next slide. I'm going to tell a story with regards to this, which I think is actually very reminiscent for the people on the panel. So we have a situation where a farmer has foot and mouth disease. They manage to move it from their pigs into their sheep flock. They then send the pigs out to a slaughterhouse, and a vet detects the lesions in the animals and suspect FMD. The veterinary services are unsure what to do. Next slide, please. And during that period, the farmer then sells animals. These animals move into a market. They move into a local.
Apologies, everyone. It looks like we've got a technical issue with Jonathan's connection at the moment. This is one of the hazards of presenting live in a virtual setting. But of course, the benefits of presenting live are always that we get to hear directly from the speakers. So I think in the interest of time, we might move on to our next speaker. We'll see if we can get Jonathan sorted out to present a little bit later instead. But in the meantime, we might go to Frank Berthe, who is the Senior Livestock Specialist at the World Bank Group. And Frank will be presenting today on priority strategies and policies to ensure risk mitigation and greater resilience to fast diseases, overcoming the impact of COVID-19. So thank you very much, Frank, for stepping in now. Over to you.
Thanks a lot for this nice introduction, and I'm sorry we couldn't hear Jonathan's presentation. I think it would have been a very nice segue to mine, but people will be able to put the pieces back together. I'm fairly sure. The title of my presentation is about priority strategies and policies to ensure risk mitigation and greater resilience to fast diseases, and with a special angle to overcoming the impact of COVID-19. But if I try to put this in a short title, it becomes investing in resilience to fast diseases. I'll try to start with a bit of perspective, and Tiziano, maybe we can move to the next slide. With this paper by Chris Delgado and colleagues in 1999, so think about it, 20 years ago, and it's about the livestock revolution. Most of you are probably very familiar with this paper and with this term of livestock revolution. What they wrote at the time is that a revolution is taking place in global agriculture that has profound implications for human health, livelihoods, and the environment. Population growth, urbanization, and income growth in developing countries are fueling a massive increase in demand for food of animal origin. It was at the time a bit visionary. And it's about the mechanical effect of these three factors or three drivers that are the global population, urbanization, and this growing middle class. What I want to say that about that, and let's move to the next slide, is that this revolution is happening now. You can see on the left two graphs, one on meat production and the other one on milk production, and you can see different lines, but extremely congruent lines, no matter the source of information we use, and both graphs, they show this massive growth at the global level. But if you break down into terms I don't like, developing and developed countries or economies, you can see that the red lines show a strong trend in developing economies. So this revolution is happening, and it's happening now. The question for us, of course, is becomes how to go with this trend, and how to improve the sustainability and the resilience, and in particular externalities around environment and climate change, health and nutrition, and equity. And those three buckets will be very important in the rest of my talk. Let's move to the next slide. So we see clearly this trend happening. The growth of the sector continues to be extremely strong, and the demand for financial support from the World Bank Group, be IDA IBRD, the branch of the bank that deals with the public sector essentially, and IFC, the branch of the bank that deals with the private sector. And if I think about World Bank, we're talking about $700 million of yearly financing directed to the livestock sector. This is a massive increase, even if we consider 2010 as a baseline. And what we see also is that this demand is part of bigger projects dealing with agriculture or community-driven development, but also an increasing number of what we call standalone projects on livestock, and we draw on a diversity of instruments to respond to that demand. I started with this paper by Delgado, 1999. I would like also to mention this report of the bank, 2009, Minding the Stock. And basically, this report casts our vision about this growing sector and the absolute need to address three main buckets of externalities that are climate change and environment, that are health, animal health, and public health, and the third one that is essentially about equity. Let's move to the next slide. So we had this situation, and then we had COVID-19 as a global stop to the economy. And I think it's good that we spend a few minutes to think about that. The first thing that we've seen with COVID-19 was massive disruptions of the supply chains, and for us, the food supply chains, because of lockdowns, because of restrictions in movements of people and goods. So access to farms or access to slaughterhouses would become extremely difficult. What we've seen also is the massive impact of fear and behaviors. The other point I would like to make with regards to COVID-19 is that some segments of the sector have shown particular weakness, and for example, we may want to remember the clusters of workers becoming infected with the COVID-19 in slaughterhouses or meatpacking plants, and that happened in France, in Germany, for Europe, or in the USA, of course. It shows that we have a sector that was not prepared, and that had some built-in weaknesses that we needed to address. We knew that because of some outbreaks before, and African swine fever is probably one good example. But we knew that also from analysis that were performed, and here I would like to use the FAIR report entitled "An Industry Infected," where our colleagues in the FAIR investment fund show that 2/3 of companies were not ready, and they were at risk if you consider the environmental, social, and governance risks. And basically, the conclusion is that livestock is listed with oil as the two most precarious commodities. That tells us about the mindset of investors. Going back to COVID-19, we had also a major focus on zoonosis, of course, and risk at the human-animal ecosystem interfaces. Started all with the wet markets, but also with the boundaries between farmed and wildlife, and we've seen also with reverse spillover and the minks incidents in different countries. That now this concept of One Health is coming to the forefront. And finally, reflecting on COVID-19 is the massive need to relaunch, to rebuild, and we've all used this hashtag Build Back Better. There is a massive effort to finance recovery and starting again. But in this effort and the massive financing that will come with that, or that is coming with that, we want to make sure that we continue to serve the development of this sector. So how does it translate for an international financing institution? Let's move to the next slide. We're using different types of channels. One is our bread and butter, what we call operations. Those are the projects I was referring to. Most of them are country specific. And as I said, they can be part of agriculture projects, but we see a growing number of standalone projects. I could cite here in operations in Bangladesh, Nepal, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, Mali, Ethiopia. We have also, and this is very interesting, a number of regional operations. One that is known of many of you, I'm sure, perhaps, for the pastoralism in the Sahel region, and we are already now preparing on the PRAPS 2 as a follow-up of this regional project in 6 countries of West Africa. We had also a project in the Horn of Africa. Of course, pastoralism needs to be taken from a regional angle, and in the case of fast diseases and transboundary diseases at large, there is value of working at the regional level. We use a lot of pre-operational tools. We spend a lot of time preparing those operations, and here I would like to mention the Livestock Toolkit, the OIE PVS, and the One Health operational framework that help us to steer those investments at the stage of design. We use another stream of work that is analytical and advisory work. I think about food safety and the case we made for it with the Safe Food Imperative, antimicrobial resistance with 2 global analytical products delivered in 2017 and 2019. The guides for livestock investment, and I will spend a bit of time on that. And right now we're preparing a piece on zoonosis. Those reports, they help to steer the bank, to steer our client countries into what we believe is the right direction. And I think that we need this steering mechanism. What is important is not to work in isolation. We use two main platforms to link on a regular basis with technical partners. One is the Global Livestock Agenda, which is a multi-stakeholder platform. This is where we can dialogue with the private sector, with the civil society, with academy and other groups in this livestock sector. The other one is the Livestock Global Alliance, that is about connecting knowledge and operations, making sure that we design and implement those investments to the best of our knowledge. This is a smaller group where the bank partners up with the FAO, with the OIE, with the ILRI and IFAD, basically. Let's move to the next slide. This is an important part of our approach. It's not like we are responding to the request of the countries by just providing finance. We pay a lot of attention to the design of the projects, and for this we've developed those investing in sustainable livestock guides. I say guides because it all started about climate change and environment. We've just finished the animal health and welfare part of it, and we are developing now the third part, that is about equity. What is very interesting is that we can see that the average climate co-benefits generated by our portfolio over the past 2.5 years is now 61%, with 22% for adaptation and 39% for mitigation. It's a massive increase compared to previous years. So we believe that again, having some steering power is extremely important for this massive investment. We won't see such a situation in the coming years. As I said, recovering from COVID-19 will take a lot of resources. So basically, my point is that what we've got now is probably what we've got and what we have to work with, and it's very important that we make the best use of those resources. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you, Tiziano. So what are the types of investments? I mean, we have those 5 blocks or building blocks where we want to ensure an appropriate policy and regulatory framework. We want to ensure an appropriate institutional framework, that is public, private, and cooperative associative sectors. And I'm sure that today we will have more opportunities to discuss public-private partnerships. The third building block is ensuring appropriate global public goods engagement. We want to continue to move the needle on climate change, on our footprint on natural resources, public health, equity, and this is just growing. The next building block is ensuring access to land and water. This is particularly important for pastoral groups. They need to maintain their movements. And finally, ensuring access to knowledge, so research, extension services, advisory services, and education are critically important. What we usually now have in our new generation of projects is what we call a $0 component, where very quickly we can react to crises when they come. And in this audience, maybe some of you are familiar with a few years ago a PPR outbreak in Burundi, where the bank was able to rapidly mobilize some money through an existing project. So this is typically the type of financing mechanism that help us to react to crisis situation. So that's about the overall picture of this portfolio of investments. We're talking about 2.4 billion US dollars, and again, I think we want to make the best use of that. You may be a bit disappointed in the sense that I haven't mentioned FMD. I haven't mentioned most of the fast diseases, the lumpy skin and others, and just en passant for PPR. But this is the reality. I think we shouldn't expect massive investments for vertical programs. I think that now we have this situation where it's more about horizontal program within which I think that our community has to develop the agility to find out where to use those investments to the best for the vertical programs. I think that the best example I can think about is probably this PAPS project in 6 countries of the Sahel region, where the bank is contributing to the effort on control for PPR. But this is not a PPR project. It's definitely a livestock project. So that's the way we need to develop our agility. And finally, I would like to suggest that we think fast, but we think fast in maybe 2 dimensions. One is fast specific interventions and fast specific investments, when we have the luxury of having a component that would directly address PPR, FMD, or other disease of the fast group, but also fast sensitive interventions where we address at large the veterinary services, for example, or the capacity. So I will stop there, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to engage with the panel and with the audience in this session. Thank you again very much for the opportunity. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was a fantastic presentation. And we do have some good questions for you rolling in, but perhaps we might move on to the next theme first, and we can have all of those questions addressed at the round table at the end of the session. So just a reminder again to everybody that if you have any questions for the presenters today, please do post them on the forum on the EuFMDvirtual.com website. And for those of you following us on Facebook Live and YouTube live streams, you can also post them there. And so now I will hand over to Giancarlo to introduce the second theme for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carissa. Apologize for this technical problem with Jonathan. I hope that we will be able to have him back. Maybe at the end of this, maybe after the next 2 presentations. The second topic of this last session is about resilience. And I think in the presentation made from Berthe has been already mentioned that one of the key elements to improve resilience is also ensuring an appropriate institutional framework. I think this is a quite it's a quite important topic. In many parts of the world, the livestock sector is contributing significantly to food security, and building a resilience requires, in fact, as Berthe has already mentioned, appropriate policy framework and coordinated efforts to reduce communities' exposure to shocks. The 2 presentations that will follow, they will provide more insight into this important part of the overall resilience issue. So with this, I give back the floor to Carissa for introducing the first presenter of this second session. Thank you very much, Carissa.
Thanks, Giancarlo, again for setting the scene so well for this theme. So we do have two keynote speakers now in this theme, and the first of those is Nigel Gibbons, the former CVO of the UK and now an independent consultant. And Nigel will be presenting today on the roles and responsibilities of the public sector in establishing public-private partnership for improved resilience of the livestock sector to fast diseases. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Thank you, Carissa. Very pleased to be here. Great to join you for the last part of this open session. So today I'm going to talk about how public-private partnerships might improve resilience against fast diseases, and specifically the role of the public sector in enabling that to happen. So I'm going to introduce by discussing a bit what public-private partnership means, go on to how it's relevant to fast diseases, and then talk a bit about the public sector enabling that potential to be realized. Next slide, please. So OIE, with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, carried out and is still carrying out work on public-private partnerships, and in 2017 did a survey of its members looking at the application of PPP to veterinary services. I'm not going to read all of this slide, but I'll draw your attention to the first bullet, which is the definition of PPP, public-private partnership, which was derived from that work. There's a lot packed into this definition, and I'll pick out the key elements. The public and private sectors agree responsibilities, for the sharing of responsibilities and clarity about those responsibilities. They share resources, so both sides have to bring resources to make PPP work. And they share risks. The risks are different, but both sides have to recognize and share the risks associated with whatever's going to be done to achieve benefits. And those benefits are important, again, to recognize, and to recognize that they will be different from the perspective of the public sector looking for public goods and the private sector ultimately looking for business gain or business benefit, even if they are driven by their social commitments to improve the world in whatever way they choose. In effective public-private partnerships, you can achieve much more than either part can do on its own. And finally, the private sector partners are various. They can range from individual vets or paraprofessionals all the way to major international companies. Next slide, please. So falling out of the work of the OIE, I'll just draw your attention to some material that's available on the website and brochures and other documents. Next slide, please. And crucially, the Oie Ppp Handbook, intended to be a short guide to how to implement PPP, directed not just to the public sector, but to the private sector as well, and makes the case for PPP, but also the practical application, how PPP is implemented. So I draw your attention to that and hope you find it a good read. Next slide, please. And in collaboration with EuFMD, there is also an OIE PPP e-learning course, which takes you through the application of PPP in a fast disease scenario. Next slide, please. So having covered what PPP is in general, the OIE also, as a result of its research, drew out three distinct types. There are overlaps between these types, and you can't pigeonhole every sort of public-private partnership necessarily, but three distinct types. And these are transactional public-private partnerships. This is where a service is provided to meet the mandate of the public sector, carried out by the private sector. You could call this simply a contracted service. It might be veterinarians doing diagnostics or vaccinations. It might be a company providing collection and disposal for carcasses if there's culling. But this may be central both to the veterinary service as a whole, but also to the response to fast diseases. The next broad cluster are called collaborative public-private partnerships, and this can involve not just service delivery, but also co-design. In our context here, co-design of contingency plans, co-design of disease control programs, and engagement of stakeholders. So this involves end beneficiaries, often producer associations. It can also be directed to the benefits of controlling fast diseases, such as approaches to international trade and how that's achieved. The important thing here is this might not involve a lot of capital commitment by the partners, but it involves personnel commitment, time commitment, and their representative capacity and their mandate. So on the private side, that's really quite important to securing the essential underpinning for interventions. And again, where fast diseases demand quite strong intervention, that's very important. Finally, there are transformative public-private partnerships, often initiated by a private company, where the nature of delivery of veterinary services might be changed. It has the potential to increase the scope of what is done in a country, the geographic coverage of what is done in a country, or even the type of work that's done. And I'll move on to give some examples of this. And it can significantly alter the veterinary services of a country. In conclusion, before I pass on from that, there is a relationship between the strength of what is done by the public sector and the strength of what is done by the private sector, with private sector involvement providing resilience, whether that's to do major campaigns or provide surge response. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about how this might work for fast diseases. I've already said, if you're going to be successful in controlling fast diseases, you need sound policies and you need effective contingency plans. They need to be jointly agreed. This isn't just about the public and private partners doing the work. It's also the stakeholders who will benefit from, but also suffer from, the impact of whatever you are going to do to control fast disease. It's certainly, and in this area, collaborative partnerships are very important, and so might transformational be. You can, of course, enable delivery, and I've covered this already. Straightforward transactional partnerships where work is done under contract, but it could also be transformational, where the private sector may be able to deliver work that previously the public sector wouldn't have considered possible, and possibly enable disease control where it couldn't previously be done. And again, collaborative partnerships to ensure that policies are sound and that stakeholders buy into them. And finally, realizing the benefits, and I've touched on this before, this can include making sure that, and this was touched on earlier, controlling fast diseases should give a boost to animal health overall, but that needs to be followed on to deliver increased productivity. And one of the other key benefits might be international trade. Next slide, please. 3 quick slides with examples. I'm not going to read these. You can read these for yourselves as I go through. But the first one in Tunisia, the classic transactional partnership whereby a sanitary mandate is given to vets to provide FMD vaccination, increasing coverage, improving vaccination campaigns, and delivering financial gain. Afghanistan, with the need to build a veterinary service, a sanitary mandate with private veterinary units, paraprofessionals in this case undertaking surveillance, sample collection, vaccinations, and enabling effective action against PPR. Next slide, please, to look at collaborative PPP. So moving on from my examples of developing policy and contingency plans to look at Saudi Arabia, where large dairy farms recognize the benefit of regional level control of foot and mouth disease and therefore support vaccination of smaller farms in their vicinity. Thailand, where the horse sector recognizes the benefits of controlling African horse sickness and collaborates to deliver control measures across the sector. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. And transformative PPP, there are more examples than you might think. Looking to India, where Hester Biosciences changed its model of provision of vaccines to improve the presentation. They adapted the product to provide smaller volumes, trained people to be able to deal with that, and produced and delivered effective vaccination against Newcastle disease, and is going on to develop that further in support of backyard and smallholders farming. Africa, number of initiatives, focus here on the Alpha initiative of Zoetis. Again, manufacturing to smaller scale to enable delivery to a wider range of the animal health sector than previously possible, and gaining better penetration of the veterinary services. Next slide, please. So these are all areas where we can see the benefits of public-private partnership, but how does one make it happen? First, we need to recognize that countries differ in what they consider to be the public sector's responsibility. So the OIE definition of veterinary services is the whole of the public and the private provision, which is all of the animal health services, including delivery of medicines, including dealing with non-fast diseases, diseases of production. In different countries, that scope of activity is covered differently by the public and private sectors. So the public sector responsibilities mandated by law, often including fast diseases, and by government policy, variably including the other aspects of what can be delivered by a veterinary service. That public sector responsibility falls generally to the veterinary authority, and it includes the international obligations of a country, such as disease reporting and certification for international trade. So having said that the scope of that public sector activity varies, in a given country, the opportunity for PPP lies within the scope which is being set out or occupied by the public sector. And with effective PPP, that can change over time, with the private sector taking on more of the responsibility for the totality of the veterinary services. Final important point is, once you have recognized the potential for public-private partnership and you deploy the private sector in delivering some of the responsibilities of the public sector responsibility still stays, and the public sector will feel this very keenly. Next slide, please. So the public sector to make effective PPP. Firstly, the public sector has to recognize the potential value. Often the public sector overlooks the fact that it has historically and still does deploy public-private partnership. The sanitary mandate, the use of veterinarians in private practice to deliver diagnostics or vaccination, for example, or certification for international trade, is very common and often thought of as just a contract and not public-private partnership, but it really is. That's a stepping stone, but you can do much more with PPP. Recognizing the potential, you need high-level commitment because you need to carry a large organization with you. You need visible support from key people. You also need to look to your laws. In many countries, certain activities are reserved to the public sector, so only the public sector can do this. So you may need to change the law to enable private sector actors. You must also carry with you your stakeholders. They may or may not trust their country's public services. They may or may not trust their private services. That will vary from country to country. But if you change that balance, you have to ensure the stakeholders understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what the benefits are. slightly repeating myself, within the public sector, once you recognize the value of private-public partnership, you need to create a culture that reflects that value at executive level, management level, but in the field as well. And there is always the risk that people will see that change as a threat. From both the public and the private sector, you need an open and innovative mindset. For the public sector to embrace what the private sector to do, from the private sector to recognize what can be done and what the benefits might be. Given that, you can co-invent creative collaborations. Next slide, please. So specifically, and it becomes much more tangible when you're looking at particular areas of activity. Why are you engaging in public-private partnership? What is your purpose? From the public sector's point of view, that is to deliver part of the mandate. It may be to deliver an ongoing fast disease control. It may be to secure the contingency plan and surge capability. From the private sector, there has to be a business benefit, and the public sector needs to recognize that. The private sector lives in a different world. It's a different environment and has considerable potential, appetite, and talent for innovation. So it can bring something to the party, provided that there are benefits. Whoever, and this means, and this, looking across the work that's being done, either the public sector can initiate partnership or the private sector, and it can be very powerful when it's initiated by the private sector. Whoever does initiate it, it's got to be developed in partnership. Shared understanding of the benefits that might be different for the different parties, shared understanding of the need to invest and commit, shared understandings of the risks, clear definition of what's going to be done. You have to commit resource and you have to engage stakeholders. Next slide, please. You need governance. So given this is not all touchy-feely. You have to have a clear understanding of what's to be done and commitment on both sides. That means governance. It might be a contract. It might be a memorandum of understanding. That memorandum of understanding could be quite loose. It's got to be sufficient for the work to be done, but not suffocate the initiative being taken and not cause costs that the private sector cannot afford. It's got to enable you to monitor and evaluate and regularly review, see whether you're being successful, and reevaluate and make success happen if it isn't happening. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. So wherever your starting point, you can build your public-private partnership capability and grow the benefits. Transactional, the straightforward sanitary mandate type contracts, or collaborative PPPs where you're working together on policy, can help build trust and capability. Recognize that a sanitary mandate is really a public-private partnership. In fast diseases, the scale and complexity of what's to be done means you cannot just give away your responsibility if you're the public sector to the private sector. You have to share and invest in what's being done. I've already said that collaborative PPPs provide an entry point. This can often be the starting point for producer organizations to grow and to build, to enable them to play a full role in properly understanding and endorsing either disease control or contingency planning. Throughout, you need to look for and tackle barriers. They shouldn't be underestimated. They might be cultural within either the public or the private sector. They might be financial, and certainly within the public sector, you have to recognize that public-private partnership is not to be free. It's not a gift. You have to invest in running that with your private sector partners. And finally, you need to be transparent about what's to be done, to communicate what's being done and why, and then to recognize success and celebrate it. Everybody needs to know, from the stakeholders to your politicians and your chief executives, to ensure that they value the partnership that's been achieved and recognize that this can be done again and in different ways. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Nigel. I think it was a very comprehensive presentation. And I have a short comment on your presentation. I was very pleased to see that you recalled the Afghanistan experience. The reason for me to be delighted is that I was directly engaged into the implementation of that vaccination program against PPR. And it seems to me that that experience falls under the transactional PPP. And I can say that it was not an easy process to be implemented, but somehow I think it was successful. So thank you for having recalled this experience in your presentation. With this, I think I leave the floor to Carissa to introduce the next presenter. Thank you, Carissa.
Thanks very much, Giancarlo. So yes, we have our final keynote speaker for this session now. We have Karel de Marché-Salvas, the Executive Director for Health for Animals. And Karel will be presenting on creating business environments for supporting fast disease control. So I'll now hand over to Karel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carissa, and thank you, Giancarlo. I assume you can all hear me. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. I work for Health for Animals, which is the global animal health association. We represent animal health companies. And today I've been asked to talk about the business side of creating a positive environment, positive business environment in which to address fast diseases. So let's move to the next slide, please. Just quickly, what is Health for Animals? We are a global association. We represent the 10 largest animal health companies, which are listed there on the screen, and 28 associations around the world. You see a little map there. We do have activities in Africa, not just in South Africa. We currently have a group working in the sub-Sahara region. And a number of projects as well. Our companies are producers of vaccines, parasiticides, antibiotics, and so on. Researchers, developers, marketers, probably about 80% of the global market, and representing about working in 140, probably more countries. And you'll see from the brands on the right, it's also diagnostics companies. It also involves digital companies, and these are the 10 largest in the world. So let's move to the next slide, please. What I'm going to talk about is the elements that the private sector, in this case, the animal health sector, need or want, desire in order for them to invest. I'm going to put a different series of factors on the slides, but the ideal is, of course, that you want 100% of these things. That's never going to happen in any market, even the most sophisticated markets. But what we're looking for as the private sector are to get the maximum out of these things. So the first one is information. And our businesses really are looking for better information about disease developments, which was, which is the presentation which or part of the presentation which Professor Rushton was giving about diseases and disease developments, but also increased monitoring and surveillance, I should say, and that does require a lot of additional investment, public and private. We're looking for access to strains. This is very important, and sometimes access is challenging. And also, information about policies. Companies are interested in what are the public policy goals of a government or a region, and what are their strategies for disease control. So that's the information point. And if we move to the next slide, please. Businesses are always seeking predictability. Everybody seeks predictability in life, and as I said earlier, that doesn't exist 100% predictability, but you do try and move to as much predictability as possible. And so the basics are, of course, stable markets, politically safety for employees, financial stability as much as possible, and so on. So those are the kind of the basis. but also predictability in terms of public policies that help cooperation or planning or long-term approaches. Stability and predictability for IP protection. Companies will not invest if their IP is not safe, or they'll be very hesitant. That's because that's a really important factor for the private sector. And that, if governments change and everything changes, that's not a good thing. That's not predictability. But in terms of animal health, I think the businesses are seeking predictable environments related to regulations. So there need to be regulatory pathways to get products to the market. And later on, I'm going to talk about traditional products and maybe some less traditional products which are now coming into the market, more innovative products. And these regulatory routes need to be predictable. So you need to be able to know it'll take so much time for this cost to get a product onto a market somewhere, and that's not always the case. Preferably, these the predictability also takes into account the rules of other countries. And so, the leading global countries and areas do in our sector in animal health have a leading role in determining the regulatory routes. We like standards set by the OIE, the FAO, Codex, etc. We like when they're applied. We agree with those standards, and they increase predictability. And another thing that increases predictability is when authorities they fight and they counter counterfeits or low quality products. Those are factors for predictability, which we seek. Let's move to the next slide, please. Accessibility. Businesses they need or they seek accessibility. Now, practically, what does this mean? You need to be able to get products into a country that's efficient customs systems. We have examples of stuff stuck on docks or in shipping yards or for months, and then the products no longer are useful. A manageable, predictable paperwork system. I mean, every country has their own customs systems that needs to be manageable and predictable, but also the availability of a cold chain. Now, that's partly our responsibility as well. To help with that cold chain, to help build that cold chain. But if it exists and is predictable, that's a good thing, and accessible, I should say. And we encounter different challenges. Sometimes we see some countries or places where you really have different national requirements per country, based on sometimes very inexplicable reasons. And this does inhibit the import of and the easy flow of vaccines, for example, into countries. We see protectionism, where local companies are favored. This is a major disincentive. Now, we can get over that in time if it's incidental, but if it's structural, that's a real disincentive to invest in the disease fight in certain countries. Slow or no acceptance of some technologies, and this is an increasing problem in some countries. And I'll talk to us about some of those new technologies on the next slide. And then zoning and compartmentalization standards. So these are the OIE standards, which we very much support. But and it's important that countries observe these, and we do see limited observance of these, and we would encourage as much as possible that these are observed. So these three factors, information, predictability, and accessibility, contribute to what we call return on investment. And if you move to the next slide, please. Return on investment is it sounds complex, but it's not very complex. It's basically how do companies calculate where and how much to invest somewhere. So information, predictability, and accessibility is I set those factors out, but it's also how big is a market? What is the focus of the diseases there, or what are the diseases there, and what's the portfolio of a company, and what are the projections of a future area or growth of agriculture there or livestock? These types of that type of data. But, and this is important, all of the animal health companies have competing demands for their investment funds. and those demands are not just in other diseases in livestock, but also particularly in the last few years from the companion animal side. And maybe a dire statement I'm going to make right now, but for this to change, for it to be easier for companies to invest more and faster in livestock diseases and fast type diseases, we need similar levels of engagement, which you've seen, and finance, which you've seen in the fight against FMD, where there is significant investment. And that sounds very negative. Maybe I'm being too negative now, but that is something that I think that people need to realize. There is competition. Moving to something more positive, let's move to the future. To the next slide, please. So I wanted to say a few words about new innovations and how these offer tremendous opportunities. We have our traditional types of products, vaccines, antibiotics, and their alternatives, parasiticides, etc. Biosafety approaches. But even within these quote unquote traditional tools, there are exciting new innovations like mRNA vaccines or new types of parasiticides, new products. On the screen, on the slide, you'll see a cover of a new document we're going to put out in a month or two, which is called New Frontiers in Animal Care. If you want a copy of that, we will be launching that with some sort of webinar in the next 2 or 3 months. Do send me an email. My email's on the first slide, my address. If you look at what's the new innovations are, and they are particularly relevant, I think, to fast type diseases, and they're moving fast. It's faster diagnostics, advanced diagnostics with or without biological samples, digital tools, traceability tools, big data, predictive technology. And now some of these, and many of them actually, are being used in developed economies. But they do require a real openness from authorities and farmers. As Nigel, I think you said, an innovative mindset is what you referred to. And Dr. Ferrari, you mentioned investing in prevention. Well, these are all tools which help to do those things. And we believe they really offer exciting tools and opportunities, particularly in developing countries. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and we'll involve you. Maybe moving to the last slide, my last slide. I want to make a few comments about private and public working together. So I think the private sector, and I only speak for the animal health companies, we certainly recognize, and all of the companies I represent recognize our duty to contribute to disease control. We have that duty, and we recognize that the margins, the financial margins which are available in the purely commercial product market are not necessarily needed. And we've proven that by investing in markets and being part of projects where those margins they're simply not there. But, and this is the main point I want to make, is if you get a combination of negatives like poor margins or unpredictable markets, irregular regulatory systems, unreasonable demands sometimes from when we supply vaccines where tenders are cancelled or disrupted in the middle. That makes it, all of those factors combined, makes it more difficult to make investments. I should say that the OIE and FAO and national governments can and do regularly improve the conditions to invest, though. And the types of issues that I mentioned earlier there, FAO, OIE, and selected governments are fighting to improve those conditions, and that's why the type of work that you do is so important. Animal health companies are open to working together under the right conditions, and they don't have to be perfect conditions. Nigel Gibbons set out a number of those types of public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships are the current buzz concept. We do believe that the market system should work better in many of the countries where fast diseases need addressing. And there are great examples of where they have been addressed. But PPPs can be good mechanisms and tools under the kind of conditions that Nigel set out to address fast diseases. And maybe I'd like to end with one final thought. I believe that both the public and private sector, all of us, involved in animal health, and that's vets, governments, companies, the full chain, that we need to do a better job at packaging why disease control is so valuable. I think we often take a technocratic approach to disease control, which is good. You need that, but we also need political communications. And when I say political communications, I mean focus much more on the value of addressing these diseases, the value of funding. Somebody will one day calculate what $1 or euro equals in animal health, and that's a real value for human health. We need to talk about sustainability, nutrition, threats to human health. The COVID crisis has given us that opportunity. So I think I can speak on behalf of the private sector, saying that we're certainly open and prepared to work together to address fast diseases. We like working with the public sector. We believe that there's a big job to be done, and we're there to work together to address these diseases. And with that, Mr. Chair, Dr. Ferrari, I'm finished, and I hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Karel. It's fantastic to have the voice of the private sector represented in these discussions. And I think we actually have time for a question. I have got a question here. It's a delicate but important question to ask, I feel. So fast diseases are a common problem in many developing countries, and the establishment of public-private partnership platforms seems to be an ongoing process, and we know it can be challenging at times. So from your experience, would you consider that international aid support sometimes may present a potential risk that may interfere or create distortions on the establishment of the business environment that you've addressed in your presentation?
I always seem to get the delicate questions. It's not that delicate, though. Does international aid support bring an imbalance, or is it a risk to the market? No. When international organizations like the FAO or the Bank, the World Bank, or OIE get involved, it also gives a certain level of public endorsement and blessing, which is welcome and useful to increase national support from governments and so on. I would say that, as I set out, we believe that in the best and well-functioning markets, the market itself should be the mechanism. But one has to recognize that that's not the case in many places in the world, particularly in the developing world. So public-private partnerships or some version of that are needed. And can be very valuable to show the benefits, for example, of vaccination, or to show the benefits of working together with the private sector. One must realize, though, that if a market is fully propped up only by publicly funded vaccines, it does make it a little bit more difficult to argue within companies longer term that there needs to be investment, though. But that's a balance which needs to be achieved. So overall, I think working together, particularly in markets which are not 100% functional, is a good thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karel. Sorry, Giancarlo, did you want to add anything before we move on?
No, just a quick comment that I see that in my experience, at least from the presentation from Dr. Karel, what I see is sometimes what creates issue is the instability sometimes of the veterinary service, which makes obviously unpredictable for the private sector to decide the opportunity for investing. This would be my comment. But thank you very much for your very comprehensive presentation. Thanks.
May I add something to that, Dr. Ferrari?
Yeah, please.
I fully agree with you. I mean, the basis, I think, of good veterinary care, animal health, addressing these diseases is veterinary, good access to veterinary care, and whether that's veterinarians, paraprofessionals, vaccinators, that's a full gamut. And the fact that this veterinary care is missing or not, easily accessible in many countries is one of the root causes of the problem. And for our products, certainly for some of them, antibiotics and so on, they need to be prescribed by veterinarians for AMR reasons and so on. So that's investment in good veterinary access, or access to good veterinary care is certain, and whatever form that takes is certainly important.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much.
And thank you to all our speakers today. I think we are trying at the moment to get Jonathan Rushton to be able to present again. I believe that we may have a recorded presentation that he's managed to make for us that we will play, but I think we may need a little more time to get that ready for you. And so for now, I think we'll progress as we had planned to now go to the roundtable session. And so the roundtable session, as we've mentioned earlier, is an opportunity for you all to post your questions on the forum. If you haven't done so already, you can go to the EuFMDvirtual.com website and post on the conference forum. We've got some good questions coming in. And we will be able to address those to the speakers shortly. So we're going to convene that round table now. Just a reminder that all of these sessions are not only being streamed live here, but also on the EuFMD website, that is, but also on the Facebook Live and YouTube live streams as well. And these will all be recorded and available to watch on the EuFMD website from 1700 hours Central European time for anybody who isn't able to join us live today. So now we will move to convene the roundtable session. And so we'll be back in a moment with the presenters for that. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everybody. Before we get into the questions for all of the presenters, we are going to hear from our guest speaker. We have Roseanne Kezich from the FAO Office of Emergencies and Resilience. So Roseanne is the Global Program Team Leader within that office for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. She has over 20 years of international development experience with the United Nations, holding positions as Deputy FAO Representative in Bangladesh and Sudan, Emergency Response Manager in the Philippines, and Operations Coordinator in Vietnam, amongst others. So Roseanne, we look forward to hearing from you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just, before we move into the next session, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to speak about the importance of building resilience of pastoralists to improve disease control and overall animal health. Now, livestock contributes to about 40% of the global value of agriculture and supports the livelihoods and food security of about 1.3 billion people. Yet half of the 800 million people living below the poverty line are depending on livestock. Now, climate change is also affecting the water availability and rainfall patterns and disrupting pastoral livelihoods, which all contribute to the spread and emergence of animal diseases, including zoonotic diseases. Now, plus the impact of climate change on animal health is exacerbated in conflict affected areas. For example, the conflict-driven disruption of livestock routes and movement changes the grazing patterns, which creates ideal situation for disease outbreak. And at the same time, conflict and stability are reducing access to resources and markets by impeding the free movement of pastoralists and their livestock, such as livestock resource conflict and further increased instability, where you have reduced access and forcing people then to adopt negative coping strategies. Now, on top of these multidimensional challenges, COVID-19 further exacerbates these pre-existing vulnerabilities. And as a result, the pastoralist systems have been progressively weakening, yet the system has demonstrated remarkable resilience. That being said, it's important that we continue to support livelihood resilience for pastoralist programming, including approaches that promote diversified and alternate livelihoods, promote strengthening of social protection systems, develop animal feed resources for massive livestock deaths, ensure livestock marketing, trade, value chains, much of which have been discussed, and invest in pastoral education. Another key point, an overarching point, is the strengthening of a One Health approach to prepare, prevent, detect, and respond to diseases, since it is estimated that about 60% of human infectious diseases originate from an animal source. Now, one example here could be vaccination and treatment campaigns where the veterinary and animal production services are limited. And this protects crucial livestock assets and prevents disease outbreaks that can have impacts on human health and export markets. Now, the cost of a vaccine and treatment are substantially below that of replacing a lost animal, 40 cents compared to $40 US dollars for buying a new animal. At the same time, we also need to improve our capacity, accountability, and responsiveness in governance institutions to prevent and manage the spillover of animal disease. And this means placing pastoralists at the center of policymaking, especially to manage and coordinate the access and use of natural resources, including cross-border dimensions of pastoralism by foraging regional approaches and cooperation. This comprises ensuring a stronger link between local and higher level peace initiatives, especially to improve equitable and peaceful management of resources. But in order to ensure this, we need evidence-based decision-making tools. Pastoral livelihood-based monitoring and early warning systems must continue to be strengthened and used. And this includes an integrated system to collect and analyze a range of indicators on various factors, all of which I have touched on. Therefore, the importance of continuing investment in innovation and technology. So from all of the points that I have touched on, pastoral livelihoods and their resilience is definitely a priority and must be placed at the center of policy making with the stakeholders, including longer-term engagement and broader partnership among the different actors, if we are to be successful in improving disease control and the overall well-being of animals and humans and the environment through a One Health approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roseanne. your comments have really helped to tie together some of the points that we discussed earlier, and that I'm sure we'll explore more in the roundtable. I've actually just had some good news that we have the presentation from Jonathan Rushton available now. So I'd like to again introduce the presentation. It's by Jonathan Rushton from the Animal Health and Food Systems Economics School from the University of Liverpool, and he'll be presenting on the socioeconomic impact of fast diseases on local communities on behalf of two of his colleagues, Wudu Jembaru from the International Livestock Research Institute in Ethiopia, and Megan Bruce from Murdoch University in Australia. So please do enjoy. Thank you.
First of all, apologies for the connection this morning. I'm not quite sure what's happened to my internet, but I'm going to try and record this and send this to the organisers. So first of all, I'll share screen. So I'm going to talk to you about socioeconomic impact of fast diseases on local communities. My name's Jonathan Rushton, based at the University of Liverpool. I'm also presenting on behalf of Wudu Jembaru at ILRI and Megan Bruce at Murdoch University. I'm going to begin by thinking more carefully about definitions of fast diseases and communities, who's actually impacted at a community level in terms of thinking about control of these diseases, and how do we improve the assessment of fast disease and animal health in general. Fast diseases, as you're all aware of, I wasn't aware until I actually agreed to talk at this particular conference, that are foot and mouth diseases and similar transboundary diseases. Communities is an interesting concept. It's a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common or common ownership. And here we're thinking about the common ownership of animal health and animal disease problems. Why do we need to be worried about fast diseases? Well, I want to provide some examples from my own experiences of what I've seen over the last 20 or 30 years with regards to fast diseases that are not present in a country and where they're considered to be exotic, countries where we have ongoing programs to eliminate fast diseases, and countries with endemic fast diseases. And I think probably an important thing here is that there's a general assumption that if we manage fast diseases, other health problems will be managed on their own. I think that's something we need to sort of consider and reconsider as we move forward. This, of course, this classification I put forward actually resembles the PCP stages. So we've got here countries that are ongoing in terms of moving towards a free status, and then countries that have actually eliminated disease. So let's start with a country free of fast diseases. And the example I give here is a farmer has foot and mouth disease. He doesn't declare it, allows it to remain on his farm. His pigs are infected, the sheep also get infected. And then he sends some pigs to a slaughterhouse, and a vet detects lesions on the animals and suspects FMD. The veterinary services are aware of this, but they're unsure what to do. That farmer, in the meantime, sells sheep to a local market, which infect other sheep, and those sheep are then moved to a market with international links. In a very short period of time, this particular movement spreads that disease right across the country, but also in other parts of connecting countries. And poor management of infectious disease in this situation has really large negative externalities. So we go from 16 sheep sold in a local market, moving across into an international market, long-term market, one of the biggest markets in Europe. And from long-term, we have the spread of animals and disease right across England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and also into France. This is not a unique situation. This is a situation in my country, one that was very difficult to manage and caused huge amounts of loss. This is a situation that replicates itself in different parts of the world. And in the past, we've estimated that it costs about $1.5 billion per year in terms of these big outbreaks. I think what we need to recognize in these countries is that in a naive population, fast diseases can spread quickly if their entry coincides with significant animal movement. And the ownership of disease management is a combination of the government and the livestock industry, the levels of which are laid down in legislation. The local community in this situation is actually the whole society. It stops being local. It's in everyone's interest to keep fast diseases out, and when they enter, to detect and eliminate them quickly. So what about a country with a program to control fast diseases? These countries need to consider quite carefully the opportunity cost of ignoring other animal health problems, because some producers actually don't keep the species that are affected by disease. So look at the millions of dollars we spent on avian influenza control that paid no attention to other species or animal health problems in those countries badly affected. And then in some situations, we have producers that have little risk of actually getting disease. And I would take the example here of my experiences of working in the Altiplano in South America that had negligible risk in terms of FMD. So we have a situation where a woman like Juanita Perez in the high Andes of Bolivia has problems with nutrition, genetics, and parasites, where we should be offering solutions around better forage, better breeding systems, better education, better interventions for the parasites. But what we tend to be focusing on is the transboundary or fast animal disease issues. So we're missing out an opportunity, and we're creating an opportunity cost in terms of helping these people on the margins of our particular livestock sectors. Now, in addition, we have successful eradication campaigns in these countries that lead to quite a range of dilemmas. When do we change activities from keeping disease out, managing disease, to actually keeping disease out, detecting and eliminating disease when it occurs? And it's very difficult when we've actually institutionalized the disease control activities. The local community in this situation for the disease has become the people who control its presence or its absence. And these kinds of difficult decisions have been made in the past, quite a recent past. So the European Union, or the Europe in general, made a decision not to vaccinate against FMD in the 1980s, based on epidemiological and economic models of predicted outcomes. Uruguay has gone through a similar process in the last 18 months. And this is about trying to determine how veterinary services would change, what are the costs of that change, and how this will impact in terms of the risks of entry of disease and the fast diseases that we're worried about. So the kinds of things we've done in Uruguay have been about mapping out the costs of actually changing from a with and without FMD scenario, the market analysis, particularly for countries that are actually interested in entering into international markets, and doing cost-benefit analysis that reflects the risk profiles around this particular problem. These countries in transition should really be thinking quite carefully before they begin a control program. What are the strategies as we move from different transitions in terms of leading towards pathogen elimination? The PCP does that in a very systematic way, so it's important that we sort of start to think about how we use that quite carefully. And it requires us to think about actually identifying the people and institutions that will be affected by the transition, the community that actually owns that disease problem. And it's likely that community will be a mix of farmers, veterinary professionals, and pharmaceutical companies. So let's move on to the things that I think probably the invitation really wanted me to target at. What about the countries with endemic fast diseases? And I'm going to go through a little bit around the cases of PPR and FMD. PPR, as you're aware, affects countries across Africa, Middle East, and Asia. 300 million people, poorest people in the world, actually keep sheep and goats in this situation, and they provide an important role in terms of livelihoods and food security. We've got various pieces of data emerging in terms of morbidity and mortality from Ethiopia and India. We've got various aspects in terms of household impacts, so a reduction in household income during outbreaks. And we also have national estimates. So some estimates have emerged from India with regards to the impact of PPR in that particular country. And we've had a couple of global studies to actually look at the impact of PPR and how we might think about addressing that with control measures. Now, that's the issues around PPR. I just want to move on quickly to thinking more carefully about FMD. This obviously has serious impacts, particularly in developed industries around dairy and swine farms. The impact in smallholder farms is sometimes contested because of the nature of the disease. It has low mortality, not morality, mortality, and a milder nature. We have estimates that we have losses that could be up to 10% impact in this particular situation. And there's a range of data that we still need to actually get together to actually understand more carefully about the impacts on the smallholder level. Now, with regards to livelihood and income impacts, it's pretty clear that foot and mouth disease actually does cause impacts in terms of reduced milk yield, reduced draft power, and it changes the herd structure of the animals actually affected. But this again is for animals actually affected. It's not across the wider population. And again, we've got some estimations around mortality and morbidity in this situation. We also have some impacts at farm level and herd level, which are actually about direct impacts when farmers actually suffer disease. They're not about across the general population. And finally, I think one of the really nice studies that's come out recently is by Georgina Limon at Pirbright, who's looked quite carefully at the impact of the EuFMD outbreak in Mongolia, where she found that there was serious reductions in the amount of livestock product consumption in the households affected by EuFMD. And that had really severe impacts in terms of how the EuFMD was actually affecting livelihoods across the different parts of the country. These kinds of estimates can be turned into national estimations of impact. So Wudu has done estimations in Ethiopia. Georgina has done estimations in Mongolia, and we've had global estimations of the impact of EuFMD. But in summary, what I'd say is that in these endemic countries, we have estimations of, in the literature, of the importance of PPR and EuFMD, which reflects the people actually suffering the disease at the time of the outbreaks taking place. These are pretty good in terms of trying to get some idea about the wider impacts across society. But I would say in general, we need more work to actually refine these estimates and understand exactly what's taking place. So I want to finish by just thinking more carefully about how do we improve our use of socioeconomic data to actually get to better answers with regards fast disease impacts. I would argue that we need to have a stronger focus on the health and welfare of the animals to estimate the burden of infectious, non-infectious causes and accidents and injuries. So within that mix is actually the fast diseases. That system then generates updates in terms of animal health assessments and the relative and absolute contributions of the fast diseases to the overall animal disease burden. And this will actually help to understand how our communities, both our livestock professionals, our animal health professionals, and our livestock keepers, are actually managing disease in their own situations. We have developed something around the global burden of animal diseases, an analytical structure to think more carefully about the underlying investments in livestock, estimating their biomass, the economic investment in those animals and the infrastructure, understanding the difference between the actual situation of animal health status and a potential status without any kind of disease problems, to understand how much we're losing and how much we're spending, then attributing that by disease to actually understand for the fast diseases the absolute burden and its relative burden, and then modeling that into the wider economy to understand who is actually affected across society. It's not just the livestock producers or the animal health professionals that are affected by fast diseases. They impact right across the resource allocations across society and consumption patterns. We're doing this with a very strong focus on understanding the animal health loss envelope, the difference between the current situations with disease and a situation without disease, before we then attribute by those particular problems. And we're using that animal health loss envelope as a guide to actually make sure we don't go outside that, and then attributing by the fast diseases across that particular program. Our program for the global burden of animal disease is ongoing. We're asking to partners to come and join with us and actually share data, understand a little bit better about how we move that forward. And I hope that this particular talk, if it's finally shown, will actually stimulate some interest. Please get in touch with us and make sure we stay in contact in terms of how we improve data and improve impact assessment of the fast diseases in general. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm so pleased that we could deliver all 4 keynote presentations to you today for the final session. We now really are going to convene the round table. So please do stay with us for a moment and we'll all be back live to answer your questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, welcome back for this roundtable discussion. I think we have also some questions which have been put from the audience. So I will leave maybe the floor to Carissa to start with some of the questions to the two presenters. I think that unfortunately Jonathan cannot join us, and we apologize for that again, but there was some technical issues with this connection. I think, Carissa, that maybe we can start from Dr. Karel, because I think he had another commitment. So if we can start with a question that is directed to him, and then
Absolutely.
we can another presenter. Thank you very much.
No problem. So, Karel, we have a question for you from one of our viewers, from Nagendra from the CSIRO in Australia. He says, the problem with the new diagnostics is the lack of information on the assay characteristics of diagnostic sensitivity and specificity. Information is restricted to analytical sensitivity only. So there has to be an improvement to get customer confidence. So this is, I guess, more of a comment. Did you have any comments that you want to share in response to that?
Thanks, and Dr. Ferrari, thank you for your kind introduction, but I am a Mr. and not a doctor, and I always think it's important to correct that. Yes, I mean, it's a good question. I think that the challenge is that there is no real harmonization around many of the important markets on assays. And but at the same time, the diagnostics business, both on the companion animal side and the livestock side, is growing dramatically fast. To be honest, I don't know if there are member companies listening in on today that I represent, but the diagnostic side of our business is the fastest growing bit in the animal health sector right now. So I do agree that there are challenges with access. Those need to be addressed. I do think that a more harmonized approach to regulating those assays and those tests is needed. But at the same time, I do think there are also, in the diagnostic side, there are also other approaches possible, which I'd love to talk to you about, but I won't because we don't have enough time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe we can follow the order of the presenters, and since Jonathan is not with us, if we have a question for Dr. Berthe, maybe it would be the appropriate time to pose him the question. Thank you, Carissa.
No problem. I'm just having a look through. We have a couple here for Frank. One of them is from Aldo Decker, who has asked, I was wondering if the pastoral system is still useful in the future. There is evidence that for many parts of the world, ruminants are the only animals that can convert plants to edible protein, but there are many places where ruminants are kept where also vegetable protein could be produced. So there is competition between livestock and agriculture, but they should work together. So Aldo's question is, how can research support the change from animal protein production to vegetable protein production, as we can only feed the world population when we change? And this will not mean abandoning livestock, but it means an innovative mindset is needed. How do you see this, Frank?
It's a vast question, and probably we would need a webinar series to address that properly. But since the question is pitched from the angle of pastoralism, I think I would like to say that pastoralism is not just about producing animal products. It's not just about milk and meat. It's a way of life, and it's strongly culturally rooted, and it's also a long tradition that goes also very intimately knitted in the ecosystems where this pastoralism happens. And so I I would certainly not look at pastoralism under the angle of conflict between sources of proteins. Elsewhere, yes, I mean, definitely we see the trend, and I think that we will have to cope with that. But I don't think this means definitely the end of livestock. I think we need to continue to make the major changes that have been undertaken. And maybe what I would suggest is that we do consider those trends of breaking up this industry consolidation of the sector that has created massive blocks, and we've seen in the case of African swine fever and with the impact of COVID-19 that there were weakness points in our value chains. We need to address issues on factory farming. We need to continue to limit the use of antimicrobials in the sector, and probably the other very important point is we have to accelerate biosecurity. So I shift a bit the question of competing sources of proteins to necessary changes in the livestock sector. But back to pastoralism, I think this is something extremely special, and we need to care for pastoralists.
Thank you, Frank. And I should
sorry.
beg your pardon, Giancarlo.
No, I was just saying that I'm sure that Roseanne may wish to add something to this very complex question that, as Berthe mentioned, it would take maybe a webinar on its own to try to answer, I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Giancarlo. Yeah, it is actually, in fact, a very complicated question because the pastoralists are challenged by climate change, natural resource management, local conflict, and then a transition of migratory routes that increase the risk of disease transmission and decreased animal health, which then decreases production and overall nutritional status in communities, especially you can see this among children, the competition for pastoral lands, for pasture, and issues around feed and a lack of information that we have about feed, which is a very important part of animal health. So it's a very, very complex question, but there are various tools in place, and one of them is in order to, let's say, mitigate the risk of conflict, which can be a precursor, or, well, it's cyclic. You can't say it's a precursor, but very much a mix in the bag. And the competition between agriculturalists and pastoralists, and creating a common platform. And this is one of the things that FAO does. And we had a project in Darfur, for example, where we built watersheds, we improved pasture lands, we mapped out migratory routes, and within those areas where we helped to improve assets and access to the assets that were critical for both the agriculturalists and the pastoralists, we could bring the two communities together to discuss between themselves and map out and set local agreements about when pastoralists, when their animals could go through certain areas of land, the benefits of improving soil continuity for the next agricultural season, all of these, to find these symbiotic relationships and to therefore improve the production on both sides, but also act as a means of mitigating a risk of transmission of disease because of the migratory routes and, let's say, the pooling and mixing of different animals all into one area. So I don't know if I've complicated the response, but it is a very complicated topic. And just to wrap up by saying that pastoralism support, it can't just be at the level of emergency response, but the importance of engaging them in policy decision making for the medium and longer term is actually it's so crucial so that we can understand the complexities around this.
Thank you. No, I don't think you complicated further something which was already complicated. So thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. Carissa, I think we should now move to Nigel Gibbons. I think there is some questions for him. I leave the floor to you.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I did see that, Karel, you put your hand up to say something in response to this question. Are you happy to move on, or would you like to?
Happy to move on. Let Nigel address that question that's coming.
No problem. So Nigel, we have a question for you from Kuhn Mintians, and it says that you rightly mentioned that public-private partnerships require investments of all partners. In terms of fast diseases, veterinarians may want to invest in control activities for which they may be paid by the veterinary services. Livestock producers may not be so eager to invest in fast disease control activities, as outbreak control often imposes trade restrictions which they cannot avoid if they do so. So can you comment on the potential drivers for farmers to invest in fast disease contingency planning under these circumstances, and how the public sector can support these drivers?
Yeah, thank you. There's a very strong link to the discussion we've just had about people being involved in setting disease control policies. There's little point a government setting a disease control policy that the beneficiary that the government sees doesn't recognize those benefits. So the starting point has to be a sound policy, and you can only achieve that if you involve all the key stakeholders. And I would argue strongly that that is a form of private-public partnership. The difficulty is, how do you engage the individual farmer, the person that Kuhn is talking about, who will suffer the impacts of a disease control policy once it's set? Very hard, but you need to generate a situation in which people are encouraged to come together to produce associations that can represent them, such that there's two-way communication, which will then inform that policy. That has benefits for the public sector, because if you're a public sector person, you've got to make sure the politicians are getting the right advice as to what the people actually want. And if you're in a public-private partnership, of course, it starts to give the certainty that the private sector is looking for, that Karel was talking about, in terms of people will actually want to buy this vaccine. People will actually want to take part in this disease control. Movement controls, all of those other negatives. Once you get over the hump of a disease control strategy that's agreed, you can then start to talk much more seriously about biosecurity, about measures people take to protect themselves in the context of knowing that you have a disease control policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to go back to Mr. Karel. I think he had a comment on the previous
Sure. I mean, maybe very quickly, two comments. Maybe first on the comment on the question which was addressed to Frank, which was plants. It's kind of the plants versus food question, which is always a challenging one. FAO has calculated that, OIE and FAO have calculated that 20% of animals are lost now, 20% of production. Now, first, if we can get that 20% down dramatically, you can produce a lot more efficiently. Second thing that FAO has calculated is that with the current livestock sector, you can decrease, and the existing tools, you can decrease greenhouse gas emissions from livestock by about 30% with current existing tools. So those are two things which people need to remember. I don't think we should be thinking in terms of plants versus food. It's plants versus animals. It should be plants and animals. We need both to feed this growing population the nutrients they need. So that's our kind of angle on that. On the second point, which is the question which Nigel, the difficult question which Nigel addressed very eloquently, and which I would just add one comment, which is nobody likes disease control measures because it limits their exports or whatever, the capacity to earn. But I can certainly tell you that if disease is prevalent and spreading, it's going to limit that capacity in the future even more. And so it's when there is an illness, human or animal, you need to control that with the tools available. Best is prevention. And I think, again, I come back to your statement at the start of this seminar, Dr. Ferrari, invest in prevention. And that's where I think that, again, we need to work collectively to find better and more effective approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's a very good point. Well, I will not go into further comments on this, to leave the floor to our presenters. I think, Carissa, there is some additional question to Dr. Bertha, if I understand correctly.
That's right. We have another question here from Nagendra Singanallur from CSIRO in Australia, a colleague of mine. He asks to Frank, with the world focus more on One Health diseases, who is going to fund the work on animal diseases, especially fast diseases? The pot is shrinking. Asia and Southeast Asia are neglected, with Europe's concentration over Africa and the Middle East. So any comments from you, Frank, on that?
Yeah, I think it's a real risk. At the very onset of COVID-19, we've seen a huge attention on One Health, and somehow a bit of opportunity for most of us. But what we realized very quickly is that the wave was far too big. It was overwhelming, and it's difficult to maintain the attention on One Health and prevention within this COVID-19 context and the needs for a response. And yes, there is a whole suite of diseases that will become unavoidably probably neglected, and I think that again we need to think a bit more horizontally than vertically, in the sense that when the tide goes up, all boats can float. And I think that we have to develop our agility to maintain the ties with those diseases that seem neglected by the international community, but also by the governments themselves, and sometimes the veterinary services. So we need to work harder than ever. To not to get quote unquote distracted by COVID-19 and the urgency of One Health, so that we can keep moving the needle along the board.
Thank you very much, Frank. And I guess the second question here is a more general question that kind of follows on really from that. It's a question from Mark on any idea how long COVID-19 will continue to affect global populations, and what are the long-term effects particularly on the third world? I guess from your perspective, Frank, Mark is interested.
Well, I'd be glad to hear the panel on that. I think we don't have crystal ball to say how long. What we can see is that it's massive, and the word we've known before may not just may just not come back. So we have to be ready for a word after COVID-19 that is not the one we've known before. I think that it will accelerate some of the transformations that we've been discussing for quite a few years now, and maybe this is a positive outcome of this situation. But again, I think I'd like to hear my fellow panelists on this point.
Yes, Roseanne, I see that you raised your hand.
I'd like to maybe raise 2 points. One, just coming back to the previous question about who will fund One Health. I think probably even a more important question around that, well, equally important, is with the broad strokes coming to, response is very expensive. We all know that. And the importance of preparedness and early warning for anticipatory action would be an approach, a One Health approach that would be very important in order to mitigate the risk and to mitigate and to reduce the potential costs of responding to a One Health crisis. When it comes to the question on the potential impacts of COVID-19, I think the impact that we're seeing is very much linked to access to markets. But COVID-19, to a large extent, is an additional multi-dimensional stress in addition to the ongoing stresses that we have already been facing. And I think one of the important roles that we have to play here is to continue with the work that we are doing with, very good information management on the impact that COVID-19 is having, but to put in place measures to reduce the risk of transmission of COVID-19 along the food value chain, so that access and markets can continue as much as possible with the least amount of risk. Over.
Thank you very much. I see that Nigel is raising his hand, so please, Nigel.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up probably on both those points, but the point that Frank made, the focus on One Health is very welcome. And there is a link to be made between the One Health focus and strengthening veterinary services capability overall. So COVID-19 actually followed the big concern we had over AMR. AMR was pointing us towards a One Health response. The One Health response that we recognized was strengthening animal and human health services capability. And the capability of veterinary services, the degree of penetration, the access of livestock keepers to animal health services can be seriously limited. And of course, what that does is limit your surveillance. So you're not dealing with the diseases that are present and causing problems, neither do you have an ability to acquire knowledge of emerging diseases, which we're now absolutely convinced we need because we want to spot the next COVID-19 as soon as it appears in order that it can be tackled at source, which brings you back to needing a very capable animal health as well as human health service. So I think Frank's point about the wave was too big is a really worrying one, because we need not to miss this wave, and we need to keep animal health services in the swim of the strengthening capability, which should inevitably happen.
I think this is a rather important point, at least in my experience, when dealing with introducing this One Health concept. In my experience and with the countries where I worked on, somehow the veterinary services, they always had a great difficulty in making themselves visible for what they were doing, always struggling to find a room for them to contribute to the One Health concept. And yeah, and most of them, they have also gone through a reform in addressing the issue of giving the veterinary services a more regulatory role. And this process has also been difficult for many of them to find, let's say, their terms of reference. What are we supposed to do now? This at least was my experience in some of the Central Asian countries where I worked on. But okay, it's a challenge, let's say. And the COVID-19 apparently is adding challenges to challenges which we already have. Okay, with this, I don't know where we are now. If we do still have time for one question, maybe, or we should close this final session, Carissa?
I think we have run reasonably far over time. The discussion is really interesting, and again, we'd encourage people to post on the forum, and we can get our presenters to respond to them there. But I think we will have to wrap it up, unfortunately, today. And so I guess I'd like to close this roundtable and invite our Deputy Executive Secretary Fabrizio Rosso to join us for the closing. And of course, thank you to all the speakers very much.
Thank you, Carissa, and thanks to all the panelists and speakers, presenters, moderators, and chairs of this session. And I was reflecting that the open session is normally organized over 3 days, and this open session was organized over 2 months. As I said, taking the challenges as opportunities, but it was also very, very demanding for the team. And just to remember that the aim of the open session is to, of course, bring insight into the EuFMD program, but mainly as a forum for researcher to provide results of their research, exchange information of recent research carried out. And I think that today we try to link the research part of the open session program, and that was delivered in the previous sessions, to more the policies, programs, control options, partnership, which I think should always be backstopped by the research activities. So I think it was a great link. We had the opportunity to see and discuss the impact assessment, cost-benefit options, and data needed, the need of having more horizontal and more holistic approach rather than focusing on vertical projects. And I think that is quite a good point with other good points that we had today, the challenges and opportunities to create business opportunities and enabling environment to assist local communities and also business. So I really would like, well, now to close this session in thanking all the speakers and panelists, particularly Jonathan for the quick recording that he was able to provide. Carl, Nigel for providing the point of view of the public and private sectors, really open-minded contributions. The Frank for connecting very early this morning from Washington and providing the insights from the World Bank, and Roseanne for joining us from the Resilience Office. So closing this session, thanks very much to the Standing Technical Committee, James and Giancarlo, represented today by James and Giancarlo, as I said at the beginning, for providing scientific inputs to all the sessions, to Carissa and Buddha for really great assisting in moderating all the sessions in a very professional way. And I would also like to thank very much our technical team, which is represented today by Filippo, Tiziano, and Alessandra. And Filippo, Tiziano, and Alessandra is a representative of the whole technical team that assisted the whole open session, but they were particularly focused on the session today. So as I said, well, see you soon. Well, see you in 2 years' time. Hopefully, seeing you face to face. Well, I hope, I really hope so. And thank you for attending this session and the all sessions before this one. Thank you all, and well, see you and stay safe. Bye.